I think we've got most people here, so we might jump in and get a start. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Tara, I'm from the Australian Marine Conservation Society. I've also got my colleague Shane, the manager from the Plastics Campaign, here with us. We've got Toby Hutcheon from the Boomerang Alliance, and we've also got our colleague Jess, who's helping us out in the background. So I appreciate you joining us this afternoon for those of you who are in daylight savings time. I'm joining from Meanjin, Brisbane, and I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're all meeting on today. I think it's incredibly important to consider traditional owner knowledge around sustainability. They are the custodians of this land for thousands and thousands of years. And it's land that we all live and work and play on. And it's incredibly important to consider the elders past and present. All right. I'm just going to jump into this presentation. So on your screen, you'll see a QR code. If you haven't already found the report that we've put together and that we're talking about today, you can find it with this QR code. So if you need to, grab your phone, open up your camera, and you can open up the report from there. Okay, so at the end of the webinar, we will have an opportunity for a Q&A. We had a bunch of really great questions that have already come through from registrations. So if you've already asked a question in there, we've got it, and we're going to do our best to answer as many as we can. But if you have a question throughout, feel free to just pop it into the chat. Jess is going to help to collate those. And then at the end, you'll have a chance to ask us questions. So I'm the lead report author and research and policy officer at the Australian Marine Conservation Society. And we've also got, like I said, Shane and Toby, they've got excellent expertise, plenty of opportunities to get some great questions asked. Okay, so I always just want to address the context between plastic packaging and the link to marine conservation. So I'm sure that I'm preaching to the converted here, but there are significant impacts to our wildlife. They are at risk through entanglement, ingestion, smothering. Coral reefs and seagrass beds and mangroves are also at risk from reduced light and oxygen. Researchers have observed interactions with plastic by almost every single marine species, and approximately 90% of these have been negative. So Clean Up Australia data from 2022 shows that plastics represent 63% of all rubbish found during cleanup events. Soft plastics make up 39.4% of all items, and it's increased from last year, up 7%. Plastic packaging continues to lead rubbish counts. It's up significantly from last year as well. And 2022 is the 28th year in a row that plastic has dominated the major type of rubbish in cleanup events in Australia. I also want to address that there is a common misconception that Australia has an insignificant impact on plastic pollution and plastic production. So research from the CSIRO found that there was a strong relationship between population and plastic pollution, and they suggest that the majority of plastic found in Australian coasts and waters is generated within Australia. We've also seen the Minderoo Foundation have done some modelling that show that Australians are the second highest generator of single-use plastic waste in the world, second only to Singapore. There's a lot that Australia can do in this space, and it's really important that we're talking about plastic pollution and addressing that at the source, which is what this project is aiming to do. So for those of you that haven't been involved in this project for very long, this has come about from supporters just like yourselves that wanted us to address plastic pollution at the source. So in February, we started the development of a methodology and audit tools. We sent that off to surveys in May, giving them plenty of time to give us data. Our supporters also collected data in local supermarkets. So thank you so much to anyone who's on this call that helped us out with that data. We've just recently released the first audit report earlier this month, and now we're going into a process of ongoing stakeholder engagement, and then we'll be looking forward to our 2024 audit. So the media attention was so significant for this report. I think primarily because it's such a common experience for people to feel frustrated about the packaging in supermarkets. From this media attention, we have a lot of stakeholder engagement lined up, including meetings with most of the major supermarkets, industry groups, and local councils. So our supporters are the reason that we've conducted this work. And in a survey completed by more than 2,000 supporters, more than 98% agreed that supermarkets need to do more to reduce their impact from plastic packaging. And the majority of respondents said that they often had to choose between their budget and their values around reducing plastic packaging. In a cost of living crisis, this is unacceptable. We really don't want to see people being pushed towards plastic options to try and live within their means. So thanks to everybody collecting data in their local supermarket, we also found that in 78% of shopper surveys conducted by supporters like yourselves, we found that loose fresh produce was more expensive than the plastic wrapped option. So it's a really important statistic to come out of these volunteer surveys, and it's supported by data from WWF Australia. And it's a really important point, as I said, in a cost of living crisis, we need to make sure that access to fresh produce is cost competitive and not pushing people towards unnecessary plastic packaging. So this is the results from our 2023 audit, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the categories and how each of these scores was allocated. But basically, we have Aldi as the winner on 20%, Coles coming in afterwards at 15%, Woolworths in 10%, and Metcash, who are the owners of IGA and Foodland, coming in at 3%. So there was 5 categories that we assessed supermarkets on: transparency, plastic reduction, reuse and refill, recycling and recycled content, and policy planning and governance. So I'd just like to go through what we got from the supermarkets and what information we found out and how they were scored in each of those areas. So these areas were weighted, and that was done in accordance with the waste hierarchy and in accordance with the likely impact on plastic pollution. So you'll see that plastic reduction has been given the most points, the most weighting in these sections. But we'll start with transparency. So transparency was all about us making sure that this information is available to you, to consumers. So Aldi demonstrated the most progress in this area with clear reporting against their targets in their annual sustainability reports. Coles and Woolworths report against progress towards some targets, but their details are piecemeal, and it's not giving us a good enough picture of their work overall. Metcash takes very little responsibility for the packaging of their own brand products and don't report against a lot of their targets. For context, Metcash, the parent company of IGA and Foodland and a couple of other supermarkets, they see themselves very much as a wholesale company. So because each of those supermarkets is independently owned, they take very little responsibility for any waste generated through those operations. And I do want to be clear here to say that some IGA and Foodland owners are doing incredible work around sustainability of packaging. Metcash as a parent company, however, we're not seeing enough from them. In terms of plastic reduction, again, Aldi made significant progress towards removing problematic plastics, such as plastic straws and cutlery that are pre-packaged within other products like poppers and salads. We've seen state bans around plastic straws, plastic cutlery, but at this stage, they don't apply to any product that's pre-packaged within another product. Aldi has made it clear to their suppliers that they don't want those plastics in any of their products. They've also made some great swaps to remove problematic packaging items like expanded polystyrene in their coffee machines. and they've replaced that with 70% recycled cardboard. And they've also replaced the flexible PVC packaging around some of their homewares range with fabric offcuts. Aldi also has a target to reduce the amount of plastic in their fresh produce section, and they've made reductions of just over 21% since 2019. Woolworths has a virgin plastic reduction target, and they've achieved a reduction of 22% since 2019. However, we don't know how these reductions have been achieved. A lot of the reductions are reliant on lightweighting, process of simply making the packaging lighter and often transitioning to soft plastics, which are harder to recycle, and also incredibly lethal to our marine wildlife. Woolworths also provided some details about phasing out some difficult to recycle plastics like black plastic trays. And Coles also worked to remove some of those problematic plastics as well. Metcash, they've received a score of 0 here. The reason for that is that the only plastic reduction that they were able to partly demonstrate was a reduction in pallet wrap. However, the way that this was measured is not quantifiable, and it's difficult for us to say how much plastic has actually been reduced through those processes. In terms of reuse and refill, Coles took out the top spot here, mainly because of some of their trials around BYO containers for some deli items, their scoop and weigh, their swapper box for home deliveries. Aldi received some points here for reusable produce crates, but we need to see a lot more work from Aldi in terms of scaling up reusable and refill options for their customers. Woolworths received some points for having one example of reuse on their shelves, and that is a product called Zero Co that uses refillable soft plastic pouches. Those were also available in a lot of IGA stores, and Metcash received some points for having exceeded the target of 80% Australasian recycling label on their products. So if you're not familiar with the ARL, it is a label on packaging that tells you how to dispose of it. It lets you know whether it's recyclable across most of Australia, and it lets you know how you need to recycle it. For example, if it has some plastic film, it'll tell you that you need to scrunch it into a ball. So there's some targets for there to be at least 80%, labels on 80% of products in supermarkets. So Coles and Metcash have both met that. Okay, recycling and recycled content. Sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. The ARL is in this section. So Coles has met their target for 80% of products with the ARL. There's some suggestions of pallet wrap recycling, but we didn't see any quantifiable data, so we don't know how many stores that's in or how much plastic is being diverted through that. And they didn't provide us with any details on the proportion of recycled plastic in their packaging. Aldi do report on the plastic recycled content. That's currently sitting at 8.6%. Again, there's suggestions of pallet wrap recycling, but we couldn't tell how much or where. Metcash received their points for having exceeded the 80% ARL target. And Woolworths received no points in this section, which is a shame. They did have one example of 100% recycled plastic packaging item, but there weren't enough details for us to score them in this section. Okay, finally, we have policy planning and governance. This is to see how well integrated sustainability and plastic reduction is within all elements of the business. So Aldi had the best example of enforced sustainability packaging guidelines. They also told us that there was training for staff on source separation. Coles had strong evidence that Coles listens to customers. They stated that the main area of customer interest is sustainability of products and packaging. So they're taking their customers' feedback and concerns seriously and reporting on that in their annual sustainability reports. They also told us that they engage with the state and federal governments, and they provide training to suppliers on preferred packaging guidelines. There's also some evidence of staff training for source separation, but their supplier packaging guidelines aren't enforced with all of their suppliers. Again, Woolworths had supplier packaging guidelines, but they weren't enforced. And Metcash received points for having a sustainability department. In terms of our key findings, we found first and foremost that supermarkets aren't being transparent about their plastic footprint. We also need to see reuse and refill systems scaled up urgently. The leading supermarkets aren't prioritising the removal of plastic, and instead they're over-relying on false solutions such as lightweighting. So we are really calling for a removal of unnecessary and problematic plastic packaging. We also found that loose fresh produce is more expensive than packaged produce, that supplier packaging guidelines exist but are rarely enforced with their suppliers. And recycling and recycled content was the worst performing area of all the assessed categories. Now, considering how much the supermarkets talk about recycling and recycled content as a silver bullet to our plastics problem, there isn't enough evidence that they're focusing on this at all with real action. Before we go too much further into recommendations, I want to address that there's two really important considerations when we're campaigning to remove or redesign packaging. So firstly, food waste. The main reason that we have packaging is for food safety and to reduce food waste. So for this, we looked at the WRAP UK. They did a really brilliant study that talked about how selling loose fresh produce can actually reduce the amount of food waste. This is partly because people can buy just the amount that they need, but it's also about removing date labels from uncut fresh produce. And their guidance was that supermarkets should be selling fresh produce loose in all instances unless they can prove that it reduces food waste overall. So instead of just wrapping something in plastic and saying that it's for food waste, we really want to see that work done to prove that these products need that packaging to reduce their food waste. The next one is about plastic alternatives. Compostable plastics are a slight improvement only if they're actually composted. So there's two standards for compostable packaging. There is the home compostable and commercial compostable. Very few people in Australia have access to a food organics, garden organics curbside collection. So that's your bin with your really bright green lid. And only some of them accept these compostable packaging. So if you're buying anything that says it's commercially compostable, but it's going into landfill, it's not actually an improvement. Home compostable certified is great if people have home composting systems or if they're accepted in any food organics, garden organics bins. But unless they're actually being composted, they're not doing much better, and they're not designed to break down in marine environments, so they still pose the same kinds of risks to our marine wildlife. In terms of plant-based plastics, a lot of people are talking about solving all of our plastic problems with alternatives, but we still don't know enough about these materials. And the options that are currently available, they still work just like plastic when they get out into the environment. So there's a really great study that's just wrapping up here in Brisbane with some researchers from UQ that have submerged plant-based plastics in marine environments across Southeast Queensland to look at how they act in a marine environment to see whether this is a viable option for us in the future. Okay, our recommendations. We broke this section up into two categories. We had our recommendations for supermarkets and we had recommendations for policymakers. So our top 5 recommendations for immediate action from supermarkets was to eliminate single-use plastic produce bags and plastic produce stickers, to introduce reusable containers for deli items and delivery. There are some trials happening in Australia, but we want to see this more widespread. We want to see a phase out of prepackaged plastic straws and cutlery, and this has been identified by some states as items that will be included in single-use plastic bans coming up. We want brands and supermarkets to take the initiative and remove them out before those bans start. We'd like to see reduction or phase out of individually wrapped or small serving sizes. And we want to see loose fresh produce be cost competitive against packaged produce so that people can choose about how much plastic packaging they're bringing home in their fresh produce. For recommendations for government, we want to see mandatory packaging rules and targets put into law. We want to see supermarkets required to transparently report plastic packaging data and make it available to the public so that customers and consumers can make their own decisions about which supermarkets are doing the best and how they align with your values. We want to see access to a centralized life cycle assessment tool. So this is something that will look at the impact that plastic packaging has across the whole lifespan, whether that is from virgin fossil fuels or recycled plastic, and the impact that it has all the way through until its end-of-life waste management. We want to see the Australasian Recycling Label and Packaging Recyclability Evaluation Portal improved, because currently, with the differences across Australia, what's recyclable in one area is not recyclable in another. And this label goes on products all across Australia, and it makes it really difficult for consumers to know if they can follow the advice based on where they live or where they're disposing of that item. And that moves me into our next recommendation about harmonising curbside collection. So we would like to see every Australian that has a yellow top bin being able to put the same items in no matter where that bin is. It will make it so much easier for us to provide waste education to consumers, and it will make it so much easier for people to understand what they can and can't recycle. So that's about it from me. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Toby from the Boomerang Alliance. And Toby is going to talk to us a little bit about domestic policy, what's happening in Australia.
Okay, thank you very much, Tara. I hope everyone can hear me all right. So I'm really wanting to talk about national packaging laws, because what our campaign's really about is putting pressure on the supermarkets to change their practices and policies to reduce problematic and wasteful plastics. But the reality is we also need governments to be putting in laws and policies and regulations in place to make that happen. Because the reality is that all the advances that we have made up until now have been triggered and driven by the fact that governments have changed policies. So, quick history lesson. In 1995, there was a lot of concern about the amount of plastic and other packaging that was being littered and wasted in this country. And the government of the day decided to have a thing called the Australian Packaging Covenant. This was a voluntary arrangement whereby the packaging industry would voluntarily start to reduce their packaging. And an organization, the Australian Packaging Covenant Organization, APCO as it's called, was formed to make all that happen and to coordinate it. But it was a voluntary approach. Now, in 1999, the plastic packaging rate in this country was 20%. Recent studies are showing that the plastic packaging recovery rate now is 18%. So we've gone backwards. And that's why it's very important when we get back to these national packaging laws that we're about to potentially see a change, because the federal government has announced that they want to have a mandatory product stewardship scheme for packaging. That means that they are going to be requiring the producers to be responsible for their packaging. What we want to see that happen is that the producers are actually responsible for the whole life cycle of their packaging. In this particular comment that's on the screen now, they're simply talking about the federal government mandating how packaging is designed. They're not talking about how packaging is collected and recovered. If I can give you an example on that, soft plastics. All the wrappers are designed to be recycled. But if there's no collection service when they're discarded, they all go to landfill. So it's a waste of time. So the big thing that we're pushing around this is that we want a product stewardship scheme for packaging that will mean that the producer is responsible for the entire life cycle of the product. That means they design a product to be recycled or composted or reused, whatever. And they also are responsible for ensuring that that product gets collected and recovered. So if we can get that up and running, that will change the game. So that's scheduled now for a consultation with the community in May of 24. You'll see that on your screen, with the idea that that will be introduced in 2025. The other thing that's happening with packaging laws is what happens at a state level. So as you'd be aware, most of the states now are moving to reduce or eliminate problem plastics. They started principally with away from home takeaway products, things like straws and stirrers and cutlery. And every year they're gradually adding to that. So we're now starting to see states bringing in new laws that pertain to retail plastics. So you've already started to see shopping bags. So some states, particularly Queensland, have a rule that shops can only provide a reusable shopping bag based upon a standard. And you'll see most of the other states will start to follow that. We're also seeing other states, for instance, banning produce bags and only requiring reusable bags to be provided in their place. So things are happening. But the important thing is that for all our packaging laws, we need the producer to be responsible for the entire life cycle. So if I can give a quick example, all of us participate in a container deposit or a refund scheme in our states. Those arrangements say that the producer, in which case it's the beverage industry, are responsible for the collection and the recycling of all their products. This is exactly the sort of arrangement we now want to see for packaging to try and solve all that problem with waste and litter and getting plastics out of the marine environment. So over to you, Shane.
Thanks, Toby. And thanks, Tara, as well, for that excellent presentation. I'm stoked to see so many people on the line joining us to run through the findings of this really important audit, which is now going to be run on an annual basis and really start to hold our supermarkets to account. So Tara's asked me to talk through a little bit about what's happening on the international stage. With this audit, what we did see, as you can see in the presentation today, is supermarkets really are just at the beginning of their journey, as are many brands and retailers, and they've got a long, long way to go. But the urgency is huge. What we know is that at the current rate of plastic production and the way it's increasing, that we're going to see the amount of plastic that's being produced globally double by 2040, and the amount that's entering our oceans triple by 2040. So this is a really serious crisis, and it's now being called the third of what is a triple planetary crisis: global warming, the extinction crisis, and now the plastics crisis. And all of these things are unfortunately feeding each other in a really devastating way. So it is a critical and it's a global problem. It's not just Australia that's dealing with some of these challenges. Across the globe, there is very low recycling rates generally outside of a couple of leading countries such as Germany. And there is very serious issues with inconsistency in terms of what types of products are allowed and what the way that they can be designed or managed and that kind of thing as well. And currently there's no global obligation to be reducing plastic. So the exciting thing that's happening though is that right now there is a treaty on plastics that is currently being negotiated at the United Nations Environment Assembly. So I've just returned from Nairobi, where they just held the third session of negotiations, and it was a significant conversation. So this happened over the course of about 9 days between preparatory meetings and the negotiations. And what we saw was a really high level of support for some very important and ambitious provisions that could be in such a treaty. So, for example, we saw that nations expressed broad support for global targets to actually limit the amount of new plastics, so virgin plastic polymers made from, say, fossil fuels, that could be produced. We also saw broad support for having a global register of banned plastic products that are problematic. Polymers, so this is, for example, say polystyrene versus PET, etc. So the polymers that are very hard to recycle or highly problematic, potentially phasing those out at a global level, as well as chemicals of concern. So things like PFAS and up to about 130 other identified chemicals that are hazardous to human health that are sometimes seen in plastics, and actually having a global register of banned chemicals. So these are very significant options that are on the table. We're also seeing, similar to what's being talked about in Australia, as Toby talked about in the packaging laws that are on the table, we're also seeing moves towards a global design standard for plastics and plastic products. And if we get something like that that ensures that plastics must be designed to be truly reusable, recyclable, or compostable in a standard that is accepted in every country with waste management systems that are standardized across countries, that would be a huge impact in terms of improving the recoverability of plastic and reducing the loss of it into the environment. We've also seen on the table standards around potential global standards on traceability and transparency. So actually introducing global standards that require companies to be honest about what plastics are being in their products, and having that reported and identified, not just at a national level, but at a global level as well. And we know that Australia was a very strong advocate for that kind of traceability, both in terms of plastic movement, but also in terms of waste management, etc., which we're very pleased to see. We're also seeing potentially on the table rules around targets for reducing the amount of plastic lost into the ocean. And the goal of this treaty is to end plastic pollution. So that's very significant. And then also what we saw was fishing gear. Now, I know many of you care about fishing gear as one of the very lethal plastics that are out in our ocean. And while it's not something that the supermarkets are engaged in, it is something that's important. We saw very strong moves to make sure that fishing gear is included in this treaty, not just in terms of recovering what's in the ocean already, but also introducing those same sort of design standards and rules to make sure that fishing gear is designed in a way that avoids it being lost, that makes it easier to recover and recycle, so that we're managing gear across its whole life cycle to try and reduce the impacts on our oceans. And then finally, very significantly, there's also on the table a funding mechanism to assist particularly Pacific small island developing states, which are dealing with huge tides of plastic washing up on their shores from other nations. So this is huge. This could be a very significant treaty. We're talking about here essentially a Paris Agreement for plastic, which could go even further by actually being truly legally binding across many of these elements. And this would be very significant if we achieved it. Unfortunately, we are facing some significant challenges in that. We do know that there's a number of large plastic exporting nations who are trying to block progress. So despite the majority of nations supporting ambitious measures, we do have the likes of Saudi Arabia, for example, which is a large oil producing nation who makes a lot of money out of plastics, unfortunately trying to weaken the treaty and blocking efforts to move towards an agreement. So there's a lot of work to do to try and break through these deadlocks and to get progress, but we are very heartened to see that high level of support. And it's a symbol of where we're going as a globe, not only domestically, but also globally. We need to deal with this problem head on by introducing global rules and standards and targets to make sure that we're reducing the amount of plastic that we're using and making sure that it's truly, truly recoverable. So the next sessions of negotiations will be in Canada and Korea next year, and we'll be there on your behalf, taking your voice into those negotiations and making sure that we're getting the kinds of outcomes that we need to see and holding Australia to account. All right, might just jump onto the next slide. So where to from here? So we'll be running this audit again next year, as Tara has said, but also there's a lot that we can be doing as individuals. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about. Now, if you've got your phone, I'd encourage you to scan the QR code. We've got currently a petition running to get a national plastic reduction target for Australia. So currently the packaging laws that are on the table, we haven't seen a clear indication that they'll include a target to actually reduce the amount of plastic packaging that's used. And we see this as quite essential and in alignment with those commitments that we're talking about at the global stage, as well as commitments that the Australia's Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, has made towards supporting global measures to reduce the production of plastic, to try and bring that down to sustainable levels that our planet can actually manage. So we're pushing for a target here in Australia of cutting plastic production and use by 20% by 2030 across packaging. So if you'd like to support that, we need as many names as possible on that petition, which we'll be taking to the Environment Minister next year. And we're working with organisations across the board to try and get as many signatures as we can. Secondly, there's also, as Toby suggested, with the packaging regulations next year, there will be a public consultation process. So keep an eye out for that in May. We'll be contacting all of you to make sure that you're aware of your opportunity to have a say on those regulations. And we'll need as many people as possible coming out of the woodwork to show the government that we really need strong laws on packaging to make sure that we're actually dealing with this crisis. And then finally, when it comes to this global treaty, we're going to need everyone holding the Australian government to account. They've been very ambitious so far, but when we're facing opposition from some of those big nations, we need to make sure that Australia stays strong. So also look out for opportunities next year where we'll be working to make sure that Australia feels the pressure from the public to stay strong in the face of that opposition and to push hard for ambitious and legally binding measures. All right, that's it from me. I'm now going to hand back to Tara, and we're going to take questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Shane and Toby. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen because we've got some fantastic questions that have come through from you in the chat and also from registration. So if you haven't got a question in, but you've got a burning question, you've still got time to pop it into the chat. We do have loads of questions, so we're not going to get through all of them, unfortunately, but we'll do our best. I can see a couple here. Vicky asked about pushing for a ban on PVC packaging. I hope that Shane's discussion about polymers of concern and the plastics treaty has answered that. Shane, I might throw over to you first. So Leonie has said that she buys as little of plastic as she can, but feels that Coles and Woolies got away easily by announcing that they would no longer accept soft plastics, and that she's still taking soft plastics back and leaving it with them. Do you feel that we should all do that?
Oh, look, I wouldn't be a rat bag activist if I said no. I think that's doing things such as that puts pressure on companies to start to make a change. And we know that the thing that they respond to most is customer concern and customer feedback. Obviously, these are very big companies that we're talking about, and they really need to feel that pressure to move in a lot of these cases. We know that there are sustainability staff in the supermarkets who we've worked with who are trying their best to make a change, but they also need their higher-ups to be feeling that pressure and from the public. So whether that's dropping off your soft plastics at the supermarket, taking them back, or dumping them at the counter, as some people have done, or even just emailing or contacting the supermarket to express your concern about the lack of progress and to urge them to take more action. These are really important actions to take. And particularly, I do think around soft plastics. Unfortunately, we have to face the fact that, you know, supermarkets are working with the Australian Food and Grocery Council to try and get soft plastics collection up and running again, and they're taking responsibility for that, which is good. But they're facing the same problem that RedCycle faced. We simply do not have the recycling capacity in this country to deal with soft plastics on the scale that they're used. And soft plastics production is increasing, not decreasing. So we need companies and we need brands to be working not just to increase the general recyclability of their packaging, but to directly reduce the use of soft plastics wherever it's possible. There are some areas where we do understand that it is essential. There are many ridiculous examples of soft plastics, such as plastic wrap around a ton of poppers, or multi-packs of chips covered in plastic, or one of our pet peeves when we were doing the shopper audits of paper straws wrapped in plastic. There are many examples of soft plastics that are unnecessary, and we do need brands to be reducing it. So any pressure you can put on them is very helpful.
Yeah, if I can also add, Shane, I think that's really important. Either have a word with your supermarket manager or go on Facebook and ask them about when soft plastics will be collected. But the important thing is this producer responsibility angle that we're very much recommending, because if the producers have to pay for the collection, you can guarantee they're going to start to reduce those soft plastics.
Fantastic. Thanks, Toby. And it has been kind of covered a little bit in those responses. But Toby, do you have a bit of an update for people about what the latest is on soft plastics recycling? Are we going to see collections resuming anytime soon? Where are we at with that?
Okay, well, right now we're in what they call a trial phase for a soft plastics collection system. This is going to be a system that is collected through your curbside recycling bin, where residents can put all their soft plastics in a designated bin and put it into their curbside recycling. It's currently being trialed in a number of local regions, and our hope is that that can then be expanded so that every council in Australia that has a curbside recycling bin can actually participate in this scheme. They're still trialing it to work out, but so far it seems that residents are very happy with this. And the idea that it would go to a curbside bin, where most people use a curbside recycling bin rather than taking it to a supermarket, has prospects that we can actually start to collect this product in bulk. And of course, the key with this scheme is that the producers are being asked to pay for the collection.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Toby. We've got a question about what we could do about silage wrap and plastic wrap around pallets of freight. And this is something that we have included in our audit methodology. We're obviously focusing a lot on plastic packaging that's sitting on your supermarket shelves, that's coming home with you in your weekly or fortnightly shop. But we're also concerned about plastic across that whole range. So on our report webpage, you will see the survey that we've developed that we sent to supermarkets, and it asks some questions about what they're doing to reduce plastic packaging across their supply chain, whether they have policies around sustainable purchasing to do with reducing, for example, ghost gear or agricultural plastics. So and things like marketing. There's ridiculous marketing ploys in some supermarkets. There's packaging, or there's plastic waste around displays of products. All of these have been considered, but the main focus of this is the kind of plastic packaging that's sitting on our shelves, that's really visible, there's so much of it, and that consumers have very little choice about bringing home or not bringing home. But we are looking at plastic across the whole supply chain, so rest assured with that. Toby, I might throw back over to you to talk to us a little bit about reuse and refill. So we've got a couple of questions coming through about that, about whether there are prospects of customers taking empty containers to the supermarket for them to refill, and whether supermarkets are looking at bringing in options for shoppers in terms of bulk containers and vessels.
Okay. Don't hold your breath on the bulk purchases at supermarkets. What I'd be suggesting is, if that was important for you, go to your local shop that does provide that. We are putting pressure on the supermarkets to do that, because it's obviously a key step forward if we're getting into bulk purchases and into reusables. But we're not seeing any movement there from the supermarkets. In terms of being able to use your own container at the deli or whatever, the fact is there's a thing called the Food Safety Act in this country. It means that you can take a container to any retailer and have it filled with food or drink. It's up to the retailer whether they accept that or not. In most cases in the supermarkets, they won't, because they're concerned about contamination. So, but it still is possible. The key thing with that is you can't use a single-use plastic container. It has to be a genuine reusable one. What we're working on is trying to get the supermarkets now to introduce such a scheme. There's a number of schemes already operating in Europe. One example would be that a supermarket at their deli offers a subscription service. They own the containers, and customers can subscribe to a system where they get a returnable container. Next time they're back in the shop, they simply return the container. the shop can wash it and you get another returnable container in the future. We would hope that that's the way forward. And we do know that Woolworths in Tasmania is doing a version of that right now. So keep up the pressure, keep on asking your local manager, keep on saying and posting on Facebook or Instagram and saying, when can I get a returnable container for my delivery services and my deli services? They are listening and they are paying attention to their customers.
Thanks, Toby. Yeah, absolutely. In all of their sustainability reports, most of the supermarkets talk about the stakeholder engagement that they do. And first and foremost is their customers, because without you, they don't have a business. So they absolutely do listen. And if you have the opportunity to put the pressure on them, 100% support that. I've also just seen a comment in the chat from Helena about being so distressed about putting plastic and other items in the bin that she's spent a significant amount of money on TerraCycle recycling bins, running around to different shops to try and shop plastic free. I know that there are people in this group and people across Australia who are doing incredible work to reduce their own plastic. We really want to see that made easier for you. It should not be the case that you have to spend more money or money at all to have recycling when brands and retailers are pushing this plastic produce towards us. So that's something, as Toby said, that we're really pushing towards. Not a consumer pays option, a producer pays option. That's really important. Shane, I'd like to pass over to you. We've got a couple of questions about greenwashing. So how can consumers see through the greenwashing? And do we have any insights into how the ACCC is going with its crackdown on greenwashing, specifically in regards to environmental claims made around green products and packaging?
Thanks, Tara. It's a really good question. The ACCC has made some good determinations. So, for example, we just saw recently there was a case of a company claiming that their plastic was ocean plastic. And unfortunately, that claim could not be proven. It turned out it was plastic that was just collected from the normal waste system on an island, that kind of thing. And, you know, that plastic never entered the ocean, and it wasn't clear that it ever would enter the ocean. So, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of vague claims like that. We have seen, for example, one of my pet peeves is saying greener or 50% plant-based plastic, etc., which actually in a lot of the cases makes it worse, right? If something's 50% this plastic and 50% that plastic, it makes it 100% unrecyclable because you can't separate out those polymers. So it's unfortunately, it has been very difficult, I think, for people when they see all of these claims that are being made. Some companies are trying to, you know, do the right thing without much clarity, and that's why we need that packaging reform. But many are also just trying to take advantage of our good work, our good values, to try and make an extra buck, and that's really sad. When it comes to the ACCC's work, unfortunately, in a lot of the cases, they weren't able to present clear regulation on packaging, clear regulation around things like compostability, etc. You know, for example, we know that if something claims to be biodegradable, currently we actually don't have a mandatory standard in Australia as to what is considered biodegradable or compostable when it comes to plastics, which means that you can't trust that it actually will break down, whether it ends up in the ocean or landfill, etc. And you can't trust that it'll be safe to go into your home compost. So that's why we need that packaging regulation. We need those mandatory standards that are clear and apply to everyone, so that you can actually trust these claims when you see them. So again, I think it's really important that we all try and support getting this regulation in place. And I will say again, and this I guess comes back to the actions that we can take as individuals. We have a lot of power. We would not have bans on single-use plastics in Australia if it wasn't for ocean lovers all across the country who've fought hard to make that happen over the last 5 years. You know, many countries, Australia included, wasn't even really talking about that as an idea 5 to 10 years ago. And now here we are with almost every state and territory with a ban in place, moving into adding second and third waves of plastics onto their list of banned items. So we have huge power. Again, container refund schemes, which are a great example of centralized infrastructure to make sure that things are actually returned and recycled. Those only happened because people fought for them all over Australia, and now we're close to having them in every state and territory in Australia, with just Tasmania to start next year. And those can be expanded to include, for example, reusable containers. We know in places in Europe, reusable bottles. They get washed and reused without having to go through the energy-intensive process of breaking it down and remanufacturing it. So we have power. We can get these regulations in place, crack down on greenwashing, get binding global and national targets. We've just got to put that pressure on.
Yeah, here, Shane. And it's really about these laws that should include proper labels so the consumer knows exactly what that product is. The ocean plastics that you mentioned is a right rot. All it means is that the plastic has been collected within 50 kilometers of the coastline. That's what ocean plastic is in by definition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Shane, while we're on the topic of trust and greenwashing, we've got a question in here about products that still show the red cycle as a recycle option, even when the products look new. For example, it looks like the labels have been developed after red cycle fell over. Are you able to give us a bit of an idea about what's happening there?
Absolutely. And Toby, you might have more to add to this as well. But certainly what we're seeing here is two things. One, there are products that have been created that are still coming onto the market where the packaging was produced before the change in the system. And so that's starting to filter through, or companies that haven't got around to updating it. And unfortunately, the Australasian recycling label currently is voluntary, which means that there's not binding obligations on product manufacturers to even have that label on there, let alone to make sure that it's up to date and clear. The second issue that we've got is that the label has been updated for soft plastics to say check locally. Now, that actually doesn't say whether or not that's truly recyclable. And as far as we're concerned, that's just skirting around the issue that soft plastics are very difficult to recycle. They can be made easier to recycle, making them single polymer, things like that, etc. But across the board, they are difficult to recycle and highly lethal for wildlife. Even if a soft plastics has a label saying check locally, absolutely do and look and see if there's an option. The most critical thing that we need to see happening is reducing those soft plastics use in the first place. And we need, as has been mentioned in the recommendations from the report, clear, accurate guidelines that are used to apply that labeling that are more accurate than they currently are around the reasonable likelihood that that's going to be recycled in the majority of councils in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. The Australian recycling label is a case in point there, Shane, in that it's only a label. It doesn't guarantee that anything's actually going to get recycled. And that's the importance in terms of what you're saying about standards. If a producer is responsible for designing a package and then making sure it's get collected and then recycled, it means that consumers can have confidence that if the label says it's recyclable, that it does actually get recycled.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. We are getting close to the end, so I'm just going to wrap up with a final few questions. We've had a question about how problematic is mixed plastic packaging, for example, milk cartons, coffee bags, for example. Shane touched on that a little bit about, having 50% plant-based plastic mixed in with our other plastic that's not recyclable. And this is a really big issue. With composite materials, so different types of packaging materials smushed together, it renders them incredibly difficult to recycle. So in a previous job, I had the amazing good fortune of spending hours and hours of my life sorting through garbage and recycling at landfills and recycling centres. And I've seen the processes of the inside of the materials recovery facilities, the MRFs that separate all of our recycling out. And things like Tetra Paks and coffee cups, and particularly we see a lot of cardboard or paper smushed together with plastic and aluminium. Those need to be separated to be recycled. Even different types of plastics need to be separated to be recycled. Plastics have different melting points. So when we melt a whole bunch of different polymers together, they will form a really poor quality, brittle product that is not really doing a great job, particularly for packaging. And this is one of the reasons why we saw so much downcycling of soft plastics when Red Cycle was operational. A lot of that material was going to road base, The program started off by providing like park benches and furniture for schools and public places, because those things can all just get melted together and make a big solid park bench, but they can't make an effective packaging option. So having those mixed materials together, it is incredibly energy intensive to try and pull them apart. And it also means that there's a lot of contamination. So if you have plastic film on top of cardboard, they basically have to put it through a huge blender. They have to scoop off the plastic. That all goes to landfill. It's in tiny little pieces. It's hard to manage. So they are trying to deal with that in terms of soft plastics. They're trying to make them more monopolymer. So just one type of plastic in that packaging. It does increase its recyclability. But we're still seeing that across the board. There's still a lot of different types of materials mixed together. And it is another consideration when you're looking at packaging types. It does make it less recyclable. Shane, I'd just like to finish off with a question for you, because we have had a bunch of people asking us what they can do. We've had someone ask whether there is a letter template that they can use to send to their local supermarkets, people expressing the enormity of this problem and asking what they can do. And I've also seen some really fantastic comments coming through in the chat where people are seemingly feeling quite empowered about things that they can do. Is there any last words that you'd have about what people can do in this issue, either in this campaign or otherwise?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We don't have a letter template, but what I would suggest is that there's, feedback is always more impactful if it's written yourself. We do often do letter templates for submissions, etc. But in this case, I think, feeling that real genuine feedback from customers, as Toby said, on Facebook or by email, etc., is really powerful. And the things that I would suggest prioritizing, advocating for, is wanting to see plastic reduction by unit, not just by weight, wanting to see less individually wrapped plastic items, etc. And getting rid of some of those low-hanging fruit that we're all annoyed and peeved about, things like plastic fruit stickers or fresh produce bags, etc. Identify those key areas of concern for you and feed those back, because the more that they hear that, the better. So absolutely, that would be really very, very helpful. And then again, sort of look out for that packaging regulation reform in May next year, which is going to be our big opportunity to really change this on a massive scale.
Yeah, and all of you have made such a difference to our campaign, whether you're a supporter of AMCS or a supporter of Boomerang Alliance. We're going to continue this, and we're going to carry on putting pressure on the supermarkets to make those changes, and we'll let you know. And what we'd appreciate is your support behind us, because you coming in behind us to back us in is where the supermarkets will start to change their practices.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that. We are about to run out of time, but I do just want to chuck this poll up and see what people think after we've gone through these results. How much do you think supermarkets are doing to address the issues of plastic packaging? Do you think they're doing nothing, a little bit? You're not sure? You think they're doing quite a lot, or you think they're actually doing plenty? I'd love to see where you sit after running through this report. Currently, most people think that supermarkets are doing a little. A bunch of people think that they're doing nothing. Nobody thinks that they're doing a lot. All right. That's fantastic. I will end it there because I'm aware of the fact that we've run out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We really, really appreciate you coming and wanting to know more about this project. We can't do this without you. This is all because of the feedback that we got from supporters just like yourselves. So thank you so much for joining us. We will send a link to the recording of this webinar to all people that registered. So if some people had to jump off early, or if you couldn't make it, you will get a link to that. And if you haven't already, jump online, have a look at the report, sign the petition, and we'll keep in touch about what you can do to help with this important issue. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.